Hello and welcome to the fourth reading of Coming Up for Air by George Orwell. We begin our reading at Chapter 3 of Section 2. Joe started going to Walton Grammar School 2 years before I did. Neither of us went there till we were 9. It meant a 4-mile bike ride morning and evening, and Mother was scared of allowing us among the traffic, which by that time included very few motor cars. For several years we went to the dame school kept by old Miss Howlett. Most of the shopkeepers' children went there to save them from the shame and come down of going to the board school, though everyone knew that Mother Howlett was an old impostor and worse than useless as a teacher. She was over 70, she was very deaf, she could hardly see through her spectacles, and all she owned in the way of equipment was a cane, a blackboard, a few dog-eared grammar books, and a couple of dozen smelly slates. She could just manage the girls, but the boys simply laughed at her and played trot as often as they felt like it. Once there was a frightful scandal because a boy put his hand up a girl's dress, a thing I didn't understand at the time. Mother Howlett succeeded in hushing it up. When you did something particularly bad, her formula was, "I'll tell your father," and on very rare occasions she did so. But we were quite sharp enough to see that she daren't do it too often, and even when she let out you with the cane, she was so old and clumsy that it was easy to dodge. Joe was only 8 when he got in with the tough gang of boys who called themselves the Black Hand. The leader was Sid Lovegrove, the saddler's younger son, who was about 13, and there was 2 other shopkeepers' sons, an errand boy from the brewery, and 2 farm lads who sometimes managed to cut work and go off with the gang for a couple of hours. The farm lads were great, lumpy, bursting out of corduroy breechers with very broad accents and rather looked down on by the rest of the gang, but they were tolerated because they knew twice as much about animals as any of the others. One of them, nicknamed Ginger, would even catch a rabbit in his hands occasionally. If he saw one lying on the grass, he used to fling himself on it like a spread eagle. There was a big social distinction between the shopkeepers' sons and the sons of laborers and farm hands, but the local boys didn't usually pay much attention to it till they were about 16. The gang had a secret password and an ordeal, which included cutting your fingers and eating an earthworm, and they gave themselves out to be frightful desperators. Certainly, they managed to make a nuisance of themselves, broke in windows, chased cows, tore the knockers off doors, and stole fruit by the hundredweight. Sometimes in winter, they managed to borrow a couple of ferrets and go ratting. When the farmers would let them, they all had catapults and squealers, and they were always saving up to buy a saloon pistol, which in those days cost 5 shillings, but the savings never amounted to more than about 3 pence. In summer, they used to go fishing and bird nesting. When Joe was at Mrs. Howlett's, he used to cut school at least once a week, and even at the grammar school he managed it about once a fortnight. There was a boy at the grammar school, an auctioneer's son, who could copy a handwriting, and for a penny he'd forge a letter from your mother saying you'd been ill yesterday. Of course, I was wild to join the Black Hand, but Joe always chalked me off and said they didn't want any blasted kids hanging around. It was the thought of going fishing that really appealed to me. At 8 years old, I hadn't yet been fishing except with a penny net, with which you can sometimes catch a stickleback. Mother was always terrified of letting us go anywhere near water. She forbade fishing in the way in which parents in those days forbade almost everything, and I hadn't yet grasped that grown-ups can't see around corners, but the thought of fishing sent me wild with excitement. Many a time I had been past the pool at the mill farm and watched the small carp basking on the surface, and sometimes under the willow trees at the corner a great diamond-shaped carp that had eyes looking enormous, 6 inches long I suppose, would suddenly rise to the surface, gulp down a grub, and sink again. I'd spent hours gluing my nose against the window of Wallace's in the High Street, where fish, tackle, and guns and bicycles were sold. I used to lie awake on summer mornings thinking of the tales Joe had told me about fishing, how you mixed bread paste, how you float gives a bob and plunges under when you feel the rod bending and a fish tugging at the line. Is it any use talking about it, I wonder, the sort of fairy light that fishing and fishing tackle have in a kid's eyes? Some kids feel the same about guns and shooting. Some feel about motorbikes or airplanes or horses. It's not a thing that you can explain or rationalize. It's merely magic. One morning, it was in June, and I must have been 8. I knew that Joe was going to cut school and go out fishing, and I made up my mind to follow. In some way, Joe guessed that I was thinking about it, and he started on me while we were dressing. Now then, young George, don't you get thinking you're coming with the gang today. You stay back home. No, I didn't. I didn't think nothing about it. Yes, you did. You thought you were coming with the gang. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. Stay back home. We don't want any bloody kids along. Joe had just learnt the word bloody and was always using it. Father overheard him once and swore that he'd thrash the life out of Joe, but as usual, he didn't do so. After breakfast, Joe started off on the bike with his satchel and his grammar school cap, 5 minutes near early, as he always did when he meant to cut school, and when it was time for me to leave for Mother Howlett's, I sneaked off and hid in the lane behind the allotments. I knew the gangs were always going to the pond at the mill farm, and I was going to follow them if they murdered me for it. Probably they'd give me a hiding, and probably I wouldn't go home to dinner, and then Mother would know, and I'd cut school, and I'd get another hiding. But I didn't care. I was just desperate to go fishing with the gang. I was cunning, too. I allowed Joe plenty of time to make a circuit around and get to the mill farm by road, and then I followed down the lane and skirted around the meadows on the far side of the hedge, so as to get along to the pond before the gang saw me. It was a wonderful June morning. The buttercups were up to my knees. There was a breath of wind just stirring the tops of the elms, and the great green clouds of leaves were sort and rich like silk. And it was 9 in the morning, and I was 8 years old, and all around me it was early summer, with great tangled hedges where the wild roses were still in bloom, and bits of soft white cloud drifting overhead, and in the distance the low hills and the dim blue masses of the woods round Upper Binfield. And I didn't give a damn about any of it. All I was thinking of was the green pool and the carp and the gang with their hooks and lines and bread paste. It was as though they were in paradise, and I'd got to join them. Presently I managed to sneak up on them. 4 of them, Joe and Sid Lovegrove, and the errand boy, and another shopkeeper's son, Harry Barnes, I think his name was. Joe turned and saw me. Christ, he said, it's the kid. He walked up to me like a tomcat that's going to start a fight. Now then, you, what'd I tell you? You get back home double quick. Both John and I were inclined to drop our H's if we were at all excited. I backed away from him. I'm not going back home. Yes, you are. Clips his ear, Joe, said Slid. We don't want no kids along. Are you going back home? Said Joe. No. Right-o, my boy, right-o. Then he started on me. The next minute, he was chasing me around, catching me on one clip from another, but I didn't run away from the pool. I ran in circles. Presently, he caught me and got me down, and then he knelt on my upper arms and began screwing my ears, which was his favorite torture, and one I couldn't stand. I was bubbling by the time, but still I wouldn't give in to the promise to go home. I wanted to stay and go fishing with the gang, and suddenly the others swung round in my favor and told Joe to get up off my chest and let me stay if I wanted to. So I stayed after all. The others had some hooks and lines and floats and lumps of bread paste in a rag, and we all cut ourselves willow switches from the trees at the corner of the pool. The farmhouse was only about 200 yards away, and you had to keep out of sight because old Brewer was very down on fishing. Not that it was made any different to him. He only used the pool for watering his cattle, but he hated boys. The others were still jealous of me and kept telling me to go out of the light and reminding me that I was only a kid and knew nothing about fishing. They said that I was making such a noise. I'd scared all the fish away, though actually I was making about half as much noise as anyone else there. Finally, they would let me sit beside them and set me to another part of the pool where the water was shallower and there wasn't so much shade. They said a kid like me was sure to keep splashing the water and frighten the fish away. It was rotten part of this pool, a part where no fish would ordinarily come. I knew that. I seemed to know by a kind of instinct the places where fish would lie. Still, I was fishing at last. I was sitting, buzzing round, and the smell of wild peppermint fit to knock you down, watching the red float on the green water, and I was happy as a tinker, although the tear marks mixed up with the dirt were still all over my face. Lord knows how long we sat there. The morning stretched out, and the sun got higher and higher, and nobody had a bite. It was a hot, still day, too clear for fishing. The floats lay on the water with never a quiver. You could see deep down into the water as though you were looking into a kind of dark green glass. Out in the middle of the pool, you could see the fish lying just under the surface, sunning themselves, and sometimes in the weeds near the side, Newt would come gliding upwards and rest there with his fingers on the weeds and his nose just out of the water. But the fish weren't biting. The others kept shouting, and they'd got a nibble, but it was always a lie. And the time stretched out, and it got hotter and hotter, and the flies ate you alive, and the wild peppermint under the bank smelt like Mother Wheeler's sweet shop. I was getting hungrier and hungrier, all the more because I didn't know for certain where my dinner was coming from. But I sat as still as a mouse, and never took my eyes off the float. The others had given me a lump of bait about the size of a marble, telling me that would have to do for me, but for a long time I didn't even dare to rebait my hook, because every time I pulled my line up, they swore I was making enough noise to frighten every fish within 5 miles. I suppose we must have been there about 2 hours when suddenly my float gave a quiver. I knew it was a fish. It must have been a fish that was just passing accidentally and saw my bait. There's no mistaking the movement your float gives when it's a real bite. It's quite different than the way it moves when you twitch your line accidentally. The next moment, it gave a sharp bob and almost went under. I couldn't hold myself in any longer. I yelled at the others. "I've got a bite. Rats!" yelled Sid Lovegrove instantly. But the next moment, there wasn't any doubt about it. The float dived straight down. I could still see it under the water, kind of dim red, and I felt the rod tighten in my hand. Christ, that feeling. The line jerking and straining, and the fish on the other end of it. God, so good. The others saw my rod bending, and the next moment they'd all flung their rods down and rushed round to me. I gave a terrific haul, and the fish, a great huge silvery fish, came flying out through the air. The same moment all of us gave a yell of agony. The fish had slipped off the hook and fallen into the wild peppermint under the bank, but he'd fallen into shallow water where he couldn't turn over, and for perhaps a second he lay there on his side, helpless. Joe flung himself into the water, splashed us all over, and grabbed him in both hands. "I got him," he yelled. The next moment he'd flung the fish onto the grass, and we were all kneeling around it. How we gloated. The poor dying brute flapped up and down, and his scales glistened all the colors of the rainbow. It was a huge carp, 7 inches long at least, and it must have weighed 1/4 of a pound. How we shouted to see it. But the next moment it was through a shadow had fallen across us. We looked up, and there was old Brewer standing over us, with his tall billycock hat. One of those hats they used to wear that were a cross between a top hat and a bowler, and his cowhide gaiters and a thick hazel stick in his hand. We suddenly cowered like partridges, and when there's a hawk overhead. He looked from one of us. He had a wicked old mouth with no teeth in it, and since we'd shaved his beard off, his chin looked like a nutcracker. "What are you boys doing here?" he said. There wasn't much doubt about that we were doing. Nobody answered. "I'll learn ye come fishing in my pool," he suddenly roared, and the next moment he was on us, whacking out in all directions. The black hand broke and fled. We left all the rods behind and also the fish. Old Brewer chased us half across the meadow. His legs were stiff and he couldn't move fast, but he got in some good swips before we were out of his reach. We left him in the middle of the field yelling after us that we were all our names and was going to tell our fathers. I'd been at the back and most of the wallops and had landed on me. I had some nasty red wheals on the calves of my legs where we got to the other side of the hedge. I spent the rest of the day with the gang. They hadn't made up their minds whether I was really a member yet, but for the time being they tolerated me. The errand boy, who had the morning off on some lying pretent or others, had to go back to the brewery. The rest of us went for a long, meandering, scrounging kind of walk, the sort of walk that boys go for when they are away from home all day, and especially when they are away from permission. It was the first real boys' walk I had had, quite different from the walks we used to go on with Katie Simmons. We had our dinners in a dry ditch on the edge of town, full of rusty cans and wild fennel. The others gave me bits of their dinner, and Sid Lovegrove had a penny, so someone fetched a penny monster which we had between us. It was very hot, and the fennel smelt very strong, and the gas of the penny monster made us belch. Afterwards we wandered up the dusty white road to Upper Binfield, the first time I had been that way, I believe, and into the beech woods with the carpets of dead leaves and the great smooth trucks and soar up into the sky so that the birds in the upper branches look like dots. You could go wherever you like in the woods in those days. Binfield House was shut up. They didn't preserve the pheasants any longer, and at the worst you'd only meet a carter with a load of wood. There was a tree that had been sawn down, and the ring of the trunk looked like a target, and we had shots in it with stones. Then the others had shots at birds with their catapults, and Sid Lovegrove swore he hit a chaffinch, and it was stuck in a fork in the tree. Joe said he was lying, and then argued and almost fought. Then we went down into the chalk hollow full of beds of dead leaves and shouted to hear the echo. Someone shouted a dirty word, and then we came over all the dirty words we knew, and the others jeered at me because I only knew 3. Did Lovegrove say he knew how babies were born, and it was just the same as rabbits except the baby came out of the woman's navel? Harry Barnes started to carve the word on the beech tree, but got fed up with it after the first 2 letters. Then we went round by the lodge of Binfield House. There was a rumor that somewhere in the grounds there was a pond with enormous fish in it, but no one had dared go inside because old Hodge, the lodge keeper, who acted as a kind of caretaker who down on boys, he was digging up his vegetable garden by the lodge when we passed. We cheeked him over the fence until chasing us off, and then we went down to the Walton Road and cheeked the carters, keeping on the other side of the hedge so they didn't reach us with their whips. Beside the Walton Road, there was a place where we had a quarry and then a rubbish dump, and finally he'd got a overgrowth with blackberry bushes. There were great mounds of rusty old tin cans and bicycle frames and saucepans with holes in them and broken bottles with weeds growing all over them, and we spent nearly an hour and got ourselves filthy from head to foot, routing our iron fence posts because Harry Barnes swore that the blacksmith in Lower Binfield would pay 6 pence a hundredweight for old iron. Then Joe found a late thrush's nest with half-fledged chicks in it in a blackberry bush. After a lot of arguing about what to do with them, we took the chicks out, had shots at them with stones, and finally stamped on them. There were 4 of them, and we each had one to stamp on. It was getting on towards tea time now. We knew that old Brewer would be as good as a word, and there was hiding out ahead of us. But we were getting too hungry to stay out much longer. Finally, we trailed home with one more row on the way. Because they were passing the Alamance, we saw a rat and chased it with sticks, and old Bennett, the station master, who worked at his Alamance every night and was very proud of it, came after us in tearing rage because we trampled on his onion bed. I walked 10 miles and I wasn't tired. All day I'd trained after the gang and tried to do everything they did, and they'd call me the kid and snubbed me as much as they could, but I more or less kept my end up. I had a wondering feeling inside me, a feeling you can't know about unless you've had it. But if you're a man, you have had it sometime. I knew that I wasn't a kid any longer. I was a boy at last, and it's a wonderful thing to be a boy, to go roaming where grown-ups can't catch you, and to chase rats and kill birds and shy stones and creek carters and shout dirty words. It's a kind of strong, rather feeling, a feeling of knowing everything and fearing nothing, and it's all bound up with a breaking rules and killing things. The white dusty roads and the hot sweaty feeling of one's clothing and smell of fennel and wild peppermint, the dirty words and sour stinks of the rubbish bit dump, and the taste of fizzy lemonade and the gas that made out one belch, the stamping on the young birds and the feeling of the fish straining on the line. It was all part of it. Thank God I'm a man, because no woman ever has that feeling. Sure enough, old Brewer had sent round and told everybody. Father looked very glum, fetched the strap out of the shop, and said he was going to thrash the life out of Joe. But Joe struggled and yelled and kicked, and in the end, Father didn't get in more than a couple of whacks at him. However, we got a caning from the headmaster of grammar school next day. I tried to struggle too, but I was small enough for Mother to get me across her knee, and she gave me what for with that strap. So I had 3 hidings that day, one from Joe, one from Brewer, and one from Mother. Next day, the gang decided that I was really a member yet, and that I'd go through the ordeal. A word they'd got out of the Red Indian stories after all. They were very strict in insisting that you had to bite the worm before you swallowed it. However, because I was the youngest, they were jealous of me for being the only one to catch anything. They all made out afterwards that the fish I'd caught wasn't really a big one. In a general way, the tendency of fish, when people talk about them, is to get bigger and bigger, but this one got smaller and smaller until to hear the others talk, you'd have thought it was bigger than a minnow. No bigger than a minnow, but I didn't care. It didn't matter. I'd been fishing. I'd seen the float dive under the water and felt the fish tugging at the line. And however many lies they told, they couldn't take that away from me. Now, Chapter 4 of Section 2, Part 2, of the Coming Up for Air by George Orwell. For the next 7 years, from when I was 8 to when I was 15, what I chiefly remember is fishing. Don't think that I did anything else. It's only when you look back over a long period of time, certain things seem to swell up till they overshadow everything else. I left Mother Howlett's and went to the grammar school with a leather satchel and a black cap and yellow stripes, and got my first bicycle and a long time afterwards my first long trousers. My first bike was a fixed wheel, free-wheel bike, were very expensive then. Free-wheel bikes were very expensive then, boy. When you went to downhill, you put your feet up on the front rests and let the pedals go whizzing around. That was one of the characteristic sights of the early 1900s, a boy sailing downhill with his head back and his feet up in the air. I went to the grammar school in fear and trembling because of the frightful tales Joe had told me about old Whiskers. His name was Wixie, the headmaster, who was certainly a dreadful-looking little man with a face just like a wolf. And at the end of the big schoolroom, he had a glass case with canes in it, which he'd sometimes take out of the swish through the air in a terrifying manner. But, to my surprise, I did rather well at school. It had never occurred to me that I might be cleverer than Joe, who was 2 years older than me and had bullied me ever since he could walk. Actually, Joe was an utter dunce and got the cane about once a week and stayed somewhere near the bottom of the school till he was 16. My second term, I took a prize in arithmetic and another in some queer stuff that was mostly concerned with pressed flowers and went by the name of science. And by the time I was 14, Whiskers was talking about scholarships and reading universities. Father, who had ambitions for Joe and me in those days, was very anxious and I should go to college. There was an idea floating around that I was to be a school teacher and Joe was to be an auctioneer. But I hadn't many memories connected with school. When I'm mixed with chaps from the upper class, as I did during the war, I have been struck by the fact that they never really got over the frightful drilling they go through at public schools. Either it flattens them out into half-wits, or they spend the rest of their lives kicking against it. It wasn't so that boys of our class, the sons of shopkeepers and farmers, you went to the grammar school and you stayed there till you were 16, just to show that you weren't a prole, but school was chiefly a place that you wanted to get away from. You'd no sentiment of loyalty, no goofy feelings about the old Greystones, and they were old, right enough. The school had been founded by Cardinal Wolsey, and there was an old boy's tie, and not even a school song. You had just half holidays to yourself because games weren't compulsory, and as often as not, you cut them. We played football in braces, and though it was considered proper to play cricket in a belt, you wore your ordinary shirt and trousers. The only game I really cared about was the stump cricket we used to play in the gravel yard during the breaks with a bat made out of a bit of packing case and a compo ball. I remember the smell of the big schoolroom, a smell of ink and dust and boots, and the stone in the yard that had been a mounting block and was used for sharpening knives on, and the little Barker's shop opposite where they sold a kind of Chelsea bun, twice the size of a Chelsea buns you got nowadays, which were called Lardy Busters and cost a halfpenny. I did all the things you do at school. I carved my name on a desk and got the cane for it. You were always caned for it if you were caught. But it was the etiquette that you had to carve your name. And I got inky fingers and I bit my nails and made darts out of the pen holders and played conkers and passed around dirty stories and learnt to masturbate and cheeked old blowers and English master and bullied the life out of little Willie Simon, the undertaker's son, who was half-witted and believed everything you told him. Our favorite trick was to send him to shops to buy things that didn't exist. All the old gags, the ha'porth of penny stamps, the rubber hammer, the left-handed screwdriver, the pot of stripped paint. Poor Willie fell for all of them. He fell for all of them. We had grand sport one afternoon, putting him in a tub and telling him to lift himself up by the handles. He ended up in an asylum, poor Willie, but it was in the holiday one really lived. There were good things to do in those days. In winter, we used to borrow a couple of ferrets. Mother would never let Joe and me keep them at home. Nasty-smelling things, she called them, and go round in farms and ask leave to do a bit of ratting. Sometimes they let us, sometimes they told us to hook it and said we were more trouble than the rats. Later in winter, we'd follow the threshing machine and help kill the rats when they threshed the stacks. One winter in 1908, it must have been, the Thames flooded and then froze, and there was skating for weeks on end, and Harry Barnes broke his collarbone on the ice. In early spring, we went from squirrels with squalers, and later on we went bird nesting. We had a theory that birds can't count, and it's all right if you leave one egg, but we were cruel like beasts, and sometimes we just knocked the nest down and trample on the eggs or chicks. There were another game we had when the toads were spawning. We used to catch toads, ram the nozzle of a bicycle pump into their backsides, and blow them up until they burst. That's what boys are like. I don't know why. In summer, we used to bike over the Buford Weir and bathe. Wally Ludgrove, Sid's youngest cousin, was drowned in 1906. We got tangled in the weeds at the bottom, and when the drag hooks brought his body to the surface, his face was jet black. But fishing was the real thing. We went many a time on to Old Brewer's Pond and took a tiny carp and tench out of it, and once a whopping eel, and there were other cow ponds and had fish in them and were within walking distance of Saturday afternoon. But after we got bicycles, we started fishing in the Thames below Buford Weir. It seemed more grown-up than fishing in cow ponds. There were no farmers chasing you away, and there were thumping fish in the Thames, though, so far as I knew, nobody ever been known to catch one. It's queer, the feeling I had for fishing, and still have really. I can't call myself a fisherman. I've never in my life caught a fish 2 feet long, and it's 30 years now since I've had a rod in my hands. And yet, when I look back at the whole of my boyhood, from 8 to 15, seems to have revolved around the days when we were fishing. Every detail has stuck clear in my memory. I can remember individual days and individual fish. There isn't a cow pond or a backwater that I can't see a picture of if I shut my eyes and think. I could write a book on the technique of fishing. When we were kids, we didn't have much in the way of tackle. It cost too much, and most of our 3p a week, which was the usual pocket money in those days, went on sweets and lardy busters. Very small kids generally fish with bent pin, which is too blunt to be much use, but you can make a pretty good hook, though, of course, it's got no barb. By bending a needle in a candle flame with a pair of pliers, the farm lads knew how to plait horsehair so that it was almost as good as guts, and you could take a small fish on a single horsehair. Later, we got to have 2 shillings fishing rods and even reels of sorts. God, what hours I've spent gazing into Wallace's window. Even the .410 guns and saloon pistols didn't thrill me so much as the fishing tackle and the copy of Gamage's catalog that I picked up somewhere on a rubbish dump, I think, and studied as though it had been the Bible. Even now I could give you all the details about gut substitute and gimp and limerick hooks and priests and disgorgers and Nottingham reels and God knows how many other technicalities. Then there were the kinds of bait we used to use. In our shop there were always plenty of mealworms, which were good but not very good. Gentles were better. You had to beg them off old Gravitt and the butcher, and the gang used to draw lots of or do an mini mo to decide who should go and ask, because Gravitt wasn't usually too pleasant about it. He was a big, rough-faced old devil with a voice like a mastiff, and when he barked, as he generally did, when speaking to boys, all the knives and steels on the blue apron would give a jingle. You'd go in with an empty treacle tin in your hand, hang around till any customers had disappeared, and then say very humbly, "Please, Mr. Gravitt, you've got any gentles today?" Generally, he'd roar out, "What? Gentles? Gentles in my shop. Ain't seen much things in years. Think I got blowflies in my shop? He had a course. They were everywhere. He used to deal with them with a strip of leather on the end of a stick, with which he would reach out to enormous distances and smack a fly into paste. Sometimes he had to go away without any gentles, but as a rule, he'd shout after you just as you were going. "Here, go around the back here and have a look. Perhaps you might find one or two if you look careful." You used to find them in a little cluster everywhere. Gravit's backyard smelt like a battlefield. Butchers didn't have refrigerators in those days. Gentles live longer if you keep them in sawdust. Wasp grubs are good, though it's hard to make them stick on the hook unless you bake them yourself. Bake them first. Wasp grubs are good, though it's hard to make them stick on the hook unless you bake them first. When someone found a wasp nest, we would go out at night and pour turpentine down it and plug up the holes with mud. Next time the wasps would all be dead and you could dig out the nest and take the grubs. Once something went wrong. The turps missed the hole or something, and when we took the plug out of the wasp, which had been shut up all night, it came out all together with a zoom. We weren't very badly stung, but it was a pity there was no one standing by with a stopwatch. Grasshoppers are about the best bait there is, especially for chub. You stick them on the hook without any shot and just flick them to the fro on the surface. Dapping, they call it, but you can never get more than 2 or 3 grasshoppers at a time. Green bottle flies, which are also damned difficult to catch, are the best bait for dace, especially on the clear days. You want to put them on the hook alive so that they wiggle. A chub will even take a wasp, but it's a ticklish job to put a live wasp on the hook. God knows how many other baits there were. Bread paste you make by squeezing water through white bread in a rag. Then there are cheese paste and honey paste and paste with aniseed in it. Boiled wheat isn't bad for roach. Red worms are good for gudgeon. You find them in very old manure heaps. Then you almost find another kind of worm called a brandling, which is striped and smells like an earwig, and which is very good bait for perch. Ordinarily, earthworms are good for perch. You have to put them in a moss to keep them fresh and lively. If you try to keep them in earth, they die. Those brown flies you find on cow dung are pretty good for roach. You can take a chub on a cherry, so they say, and I've seen a roach taken with a currant out of a bun. In those days, from 16th of June, when the coarse fishing season starts, till midwinter, I was often without a tin of worms or gentles in my pocket. I wasn't often without a tin of worms or gentles in my pocket. I had some fight with Mother about it, but it was the end she gave in. Fishing came off the list of forbidden things, and Father even gave me a 2 shillings fishing rod for Christmas in 1903. Joe was barely 15 when he started going after girls, and from then on he seldom came out fishing, which he said was a kid's game, but there were about half a dozen others who were as mad on fishing as I was. Christ, those fishing days, the hot sticky afternoons in the schoolroom when I've sprawled across my desk with the blower's voice grating away about predicates and subjectives and relative causes, and all that in my mind is the backwater near Buford Weir and the green pond under the willows with the dace gliding to and fro. And then the terrific rush on bicycles after tea to Chamford Hill and down to the river to get in an hour's fishing before dark. The still summer evening, the faint splash of the weir, the rings on the water where the fish are rising, the midges eating you alive, the souls of dance warning round your hook and never biting, and the kind of passion with which you watch the black backs of the fish swarming round, hoping and praying, yes, literally praying, that one of them would change his mind and grab your bait before it got too dark. And then it was always, let's have 5 minutes more, and then just 5 minutes more, until in the end you had to walk your bike down into the town because Towler the copper was prowling around and you could be had up for riding without a light. And the times in the summer holidays when we went out to make a day of it with boiled eggs and bread and butter and a bottle of lemonade, and fished and bathed, and then fishing again, and did occasionally catch something. At night you come home with filthy hands, so hungry that you'd eat what was left of your bread paste, with 3 or 4 smelly dace wrapped up in your handkerchief. Mother always refused to cook the fish I brought home. She would never allow that river fish were edible, except trout and salmon, nasty muddy things she called them. The fish I remember best of all were the ones I didn't catch, especially the monstrous fish that I always used to see when you went for a long walk along the towpath on Sunday afternoon and hadn't a rod with you. There was no fishing on Sundays. Even the Thames Conservatory Board didn't allow it. On Sundays, you had to go for what you called a nice walk in your thick black suit and the Eton collar and sawed your head off. Ugh, I can't read. It was on a Sunday that I saw a pike a yard long asleep in a shallow water by the bank and nearly got him with a stone. And sometimes in the green pools on the edge of the reeds, you'd see a huge Thames trout go sailing past. The trout grow to vast sizes in the Thames, but they are practically never caught. They say that one of the real Thames fishermen, the old bottlenose blokes that you used to muffled up in the overcoats on camp stools, with 20-foot roach poles at all seasons of the year, would willingly give up a year of his life to catching a Thames trout. I didn't blame them. I see their point entirely, and still better I saw it then. Of course, other things were happening. I grew 3 inches in a year, and my long trousers won some prizes at school. Went to confirmation classes, told dirty stories, took to reading, and had crazes for white mice, fretwork, and postage stamps. But it isn't always fishing that I remember. Summer days and the flat water meadows and the blue hills in the distance, and the willows up the backwater and the pools underneath like a kind of deep green glass. Summer evenings, the fish breaking the water, the night jaws hawking around your head, and the smell of night stalks and latakia. Don't mistake what I'm talking about. It's not that I'm trying to put across any of that poetry of childish stuff. I know that's all baloney. Oh, Porteous, a friend of mine, a retired schoolmaster, I'll tell you about him later, is great on the poetry of childhood. Sometimes he reads me stuff about it out of books. Wordsworth, Lucy Gray, there was a time when Meadow Grove and all that. Needless to say, he's got no kids of his own. The truth is that kids aren't in any way poetic. They're merely savage like animals, except no animal is a quarter as selfish. A boy isn't interested in meadows, groves, and so forth. He never looked at a landscape, doesn't give a damn for flowers, and unless they affect him in some way, such as being good to eat, he doesn't know one plant from another. Killing things, that's about as near to poetry as a boy gets, and yet all the while, there's that peculiar intensity, the power of longing for those things you can't long when you're growing up, and the feeling that you things as you can't long when you're growing up. And yet all the while, there's that peculiar intensity, the power of longing for things you can't long when you're grown up, and the feeling that time stretches out and out in front of you, and that whatever you're doing, you could go on forever. I was rather an ugly little boy with butter-colored hair, which was always cropped short except for a quiff in front. I didn't idealize my childhood, and unlike many people, I've not wished to be young again. Most of the things I used to care for would leave me something more than cold. I don't care if I never see a cricket ball again, and I wouldn't give you 3 pence for 100 weight of sweets. But I've always had the peculiar feeling for fishing. You'll think it damn silly, no doubt, but I've actually have a wish to go fishing even now. When I'm fat and 45 and got 2 kids in a house in the suburbs, why? Because in a manner of speaking, I am sentimental about my childhood. Not my own particular childhood, but the civilization which I grew up in and which is now, I suppose, just about as its last kick. And fishing is somehow typical of the civilization. As soon as you think of fishing, you think of things that you didn't believe to them. As soon as you think of fishing, you think of things that don't belong to the modern world. The very idea of sitting all day under a willow tree beside a quiet pool and being able to find a quiet pool to sit beside belongs to the time before the war. Before the radio, before airplanes, before Hitler. There's a kind of peacefulness even in the names of English coarse fish. Roach, rudd, dace, bleak, barbel, breen, gudgeon, pike, chub, carp, tench. They're solid kind of names. The people who made them up hadn't heard of machine guns. They didn't live in terror of the sack or spent their time in eating aspirins, going to the pictures, and wondering how to keep out of the concentration camp. Does anyone go fishing nowadays, I wonder? Anywhere within 100 miles of London, there are no fish left to catch. A few dismal fishing clubs plant themselves in rows along the banks of canals, and millionaires go trout fishing in private waters round Scotch hotels, a sort of snobbish game of catching hand-reared fish with artificial flies. But who fishes in mill streams or moats or cow ponds any longer? Where are the English coarse fish now? When I was a kid, every pond and stream had fish in it. Now all the ponds are drained, and when the streams aren't poisoned with chemicals from factories, they're full of rusty tins and motorbike tires. My best fishing memories is about some fish that I had never caught. That's usually enough, I suppose. When I was about 14, Father did a good turn of some kind to old Hodges, the caretaker at Binfield House. I forgot what it was, gave him some medicine that cured his fowls of the worms or something. Hodges was a crabby old devil, but he didn't forget a good turn. One day, a little while afterwards, when he'd been down to the shop to buy chicken corn, he met me outside the door and stopped me in his surly way. He had a face like something carved out of a bit of root, and only 2 teeth, which were dark brown and very long. "Hey, young un, fisherman, aren't you?" "Yes." "Thought you was. You listen, then. If so be you wanted to, you could bring your line and have a try in that they pond up ahide the hall. There's plenty bream and jack in there, but don't you tell no one as I told you. And don't you go for to bring any of them other young whelps, or I'll beat the skin off their backs." Having said this, he hobbled off with his sack of corn over his shoulder, as though feeling that he said too much already. Then next Saturday afternoon I biked up to Binfield House with my pockets full of worms and gentles and looked for old Hodges at the lodge. At the time Binfield House was already been empty for 10 or 20 years. Mr. Farrell, the owner, couldn't afford to live in it, and either couldn't or wouldn't let it. He lived in London on the rent of his farms and let the house and grounds go to the devil. All the fences were green and rotting. The park was a mass of nettles. The plantations were like a jungle, and even the gardens had gone back to meadows, with only a few old gnarled rose bushes to show you where the beds had been. But it was a very beautiful house, especially from a distance. It was a great white place with colonnades and long-shaped windows, which had been built, I suppose, about Queen Anne's time by someone who traveled in Italy. If I went there now, I'd probably been a certain kick out of wandering round the general desolation and thinking about the life that used to go on in there, and the people who built such places because they imagined that the good days would last forever. As soon as a boy, I didn't either give the house or the grounds a second look. I dug out the old Hodges, who'd just finished his dinner and was a bit surly, got him to show me the way down to the pond. It was several hundred yards behind the house and completely hidden in the beech woods, but it was a good-sized pool, almost a lake, about 150 yards across. It was astonishing, and even at the age, it astonished me that there, a dozen miles from Reading and not 50 from London, you could have such solitude. You felt as much alone as if you had been on the banks of the Amazon. The pool was rigid, completely round by the enormous beech trees, which in one place came down to the edge and were reflecting in the water. On the other side there was a patch of grass where there was a hollow with beds of wild peppermint, and up at one end of the pool an old wooden boathouse was rotting among the bulrushes. The pool was swarming with bream, small ones, about 4 to 6 inches long. Every now and again you'd see one of them turn half over and gleam reddy brown under the water. There were pike there too, and they must have been big ones. You never saw them, but sometimes one of them was basking among the weeds, would turn over and plunge with a splash that was like a brick being bunged into the water. It was no use trying to catch them, though, of course, I always tried every time I was there. I tried them with dace and minnows I'd caught in the Thames and kept alive in a jam jar, and even with spinner made out of a bit of tin, but they were gorged with fish and wouldn't bite. But they were, and in any case, they'd have broken any tackle I possessed. I never came back from the pool with at least a dozen small bream. Sometimes in the summer holidays, I went there for a whole day with my fishing rod and a copy of Chums or the Union Jack or something, and a hunk of bread and cheese with Mother had strapped up for me, and I fished for hours and then laid in the grass hollow and read the Union Jack. And then the smell of my bread paste and the plop of the fish jumping somewhere would send me wild again, and I'd go back to the water and have another go, and so on all through the summer's day. And the best of all was to be home, alone, utterly alone. Though the road wasn't a quarter of a mile away, I was just old enough to know that it's good to be alone occasionally. With the trees all around you, it was as though the pool belonged to you, and nothing ever stirred except the fish ringing the water and the pigeons passing overhead. And yet, in the 2 years or so that I went fishing there, how many times did I really go, I wonder? No, not more than a dozen. It was a 3-mile bike ride from home and took up a whole afternoon at least, and sometimes other things turned up, and sometimes when I'd meant to go it rained. You know that the way things happen. One afternoon the fish weren't biting, and I began to explore at the end of the pond farthest from Binfield House. There was a bit of overflow of water, and the ground was boggy, and you had to fight your way through a sort of jungle of blackberry bushes and a rotten boughs that had fallen off the trees. I struggled through it for about 50 yards, and then suddenly there was a clearing, and I came to another pool which I had never known existed. It was a small pool, not more than 20 yards wide, and rather dark because of the boughs that overhung it. But it was a very clear water and immensely deep. I could see 10 or 15 feet down into it. I hung about a bit, enjoying the dampness and the rotten boggy smell, the way a boy does, and then I saw something that almost made me jump out of my skin. It was an enormous fish. I didn't exaggerate when I say it was enormous. It was almost the length of my arms. It glided across the pool, deep under water, and then became a shadow and disappeared into the darker water on the other side. I felt as if a sword had gone through me. It was far from biggest fish I've ever seen, dead or alive. It was far the biggest fish I'd ever seen, dead or alive. I stood there without breathing, and in a moment another huge, thick shape glided through the water, and then another, and then two more close together. The pool was full of them. They were carp, I suppose. Just possibly they were bream or tench, but more probably carp. Bream or tench wouldn't grow so huge. I knew that what had happened. At some time this pool had been connected with the other, and then the stream had dried up and the woods had closed round the pool, and it had just been forgotten. It's a thing that happens occasionally. A pool gets forgotten somehow. Nobody fishes in it for years and decades, and the fish grow to monstrous sizes. The brutes that I was watching might be 100 years old, and not a soul in the world knew about them except me. Very likely it was 20 years since anyone had so much as looked at the pool, and probably even old Hodges and the Mr. Farrell's bailiff had forgotten its existence. Well, you can imagine how I felt. After a bit I couldn't even bear the tantalization of watching. I hurried back to the other pool, got my fishing things together. It was no use trying for those colossal brutes with the tackle I had. They'd snap it as if it had been a hare, and I couldn't go on fishing any longer for the tiny bream. The sight of the big carp had given me a feeling in my stomach, almost as if it was going to be sick. I got on my bike, whizzed down the hill and home. It was a wonderful secret for a boy to have. There was the dark pool hidden away in the woods, and the monstrous fish sailing around in it. Fish had never been fished for, and would grab the first bait you offered them. It was only a question of getting hold of a line strong enough to hold them. Already I'd made all the arrangements. I'd buy the tackle that would hold them if I had to steal the money out of the till. Somehow, God knew how, I'd get hold of half a crown and buy a length of silk salmon line and some thick gut or gimp and number 5 hooks, and come back with cheese and gentles and paste and mealworms and brandlings and grasshoppers and every mortal bait a carp might look at. The very next Saturday afternoon I'd come back and try for them. But as it happened, I never went back. One never does go back. I never stole the money out of the till or bought the bit of salmon line or had a try for those carp. Almost immediately afterwards, something turned up to prevent me. But if I hadn't been that, it would have been something else. It's the way things happen. I know, of course, that you think I'm exaggerating about the size of those fish. You think probably that they were just medium-sized fish, a foot long, say, and that They've swollen gradually in my memory, but it isn't so. People tell lies about the fish they've caught, and still more about the fish they are hooked and get away, but I never caught any of these or tried to catch them, and I have no motive of lying. I tell you, they were enormous. And thus ends the reading of George Orwell's Coming Up for Air. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed.